Good morning. My name is John Harrington. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Public Safety, and I want to welcome you all to today's announcement of the 28 recommendations from the Reducing Deadly Force Working Group. About a year ago, Attorney General Ellison and I began having conversations around the use of deadly force in police and in community. And it really was about both. It was about young African-American men dying on the streets of our cities and in the state of Minnesota. It was also about deadly force use by police officers all over the state of Minnesota. As we began having that conversation, we realized that we had an opportunity to bring to light a question of how could our communities be safer? How could our young people feel safer? How could our officers be better prepared, and how could they be safer also? After a year of deliberations and meetings, we're here today to make a set of announcements from that conversation. One of our earliest meetings, it struck me that as we were hearing the voices of victims, of moms, of survivors, that what we were doing was we were lighting a candle rather than simply cursing the fact that there was darkness out there. We recognize that with the loss of life, no matter under what circumstance, it is a tragedy. But we recognize also that we have a responsibility as public safety officials, as government officials, as leaders in community to do something about that. And what we did in this last year, I think, is to take a step forward to try and reduce deadly force encounters. We're here today to announce 28 recommendations and 33 action items that this working group believes, if implemented, will prevent and reduce officer-involved shootings in the state of Minnesota. I want to thank my partners in this. It was truly a group effort. We brought people together that I'm not sure if people thought would necessarily want to be at the same table together. We brought folks from police and community. Sometimes folks that have been on the opposite sides of the aisles. We brought prosecutors, we brought folks from the ACLU together. We brought academics and folks from the philanthropic community together. We brought victims and their families together with families of officers who had died in the line of duty and brought them together to have a conversation. I really need to thank Attorney General Ellison because without his leadership and without his staunch support, we couldn't be here today. I also want to thank Ron Davis and the folks from 21CP, 21st Century Policing, and Jim Koppel in particular, who led our facilitation team. Over the course of the last 5 years, there have been well over 100 officer-involved shootings in the state of Minnesota. One of the things that was surprising to many of us that was 60% of those happened in greater Minnesota. And as much as I think we all hear about the ones that happen in the Twin Cities, it's greater Minnesota where we spent a lot of our time having this conversation. We know that these actions have affected not just a few, but literally almost every county in the state of Minnesota, and the number of families that have lost loved ones on both sides of the line. Young people who grew up without fathers, mothers who grew up without husbands, and cop families who grew up without their partners also. We know that this affects across the board, that these are tragedies. And because of that tragedy, we knew we had to do something more than simply think about it. Our working group, as I said, is a cross-sectional group. It is very diverse. It is urban and it is rural. And when we announced this effort in July, I want you to know we did not have any real preconceived notion of where this was going to take us. I think a lot of people said, oh, you know what you're going to do already. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that what we knew was we were going to ask the hard questions, that we were going to ask really tough questions, and we were going to dig and dig and dig some more until we could find out answers that made some sense. To get there, we held hearings and listening sessions across the state of Minnesota, from St. Paul to Brooklyn Park, from Minneapolis, and then up to Bemidji, down to Worthington, over to Mankato, and up to Cloquet. We were across the state of Minnesota, listening to people from communities large and small, urban and rural, suburban, and everything in between. The families and communities of those who have died and have been involved in officer-involved shootings were, in fact, as much the subject matter experts as were the real experts, the academics and the lawyers and the technical folks we brought in to tell us information. They had a firsthand knowledge of what it was like to lose a loved one that you cannot undercut, you cannot minimize. The tragedy that they've gone through and their experience makes them experts of a different kind. It's a lived expertise that's different than what we have from the law professors who came in and gave us information. Because of their work, because of 50 subject matter experts in addition to them, we have a set of recommendations that we're ready to put forward. And I want you to know, then this is a statement that I think the Attorney General and I have said over and over again. These recommendations are, in fact, the beginning. While this may be the end of the working group as a process, the beginning of the real work starts today as we begin to try and figure out how do we bring into implementation the recommendations that the working group has brought forward. It's not enough simply to shout into the darkness. It is in fact incumbent upon us to get the work done and to make these working group recommendations into a reality. The full report will be issued in a couple weeks, and I will tell you that DPS has taken this seriously. One note would be that one of the first recommendations we heard from families was the need for a family liaison to work with families whose loved one had been killed in an officer-involved shooting. The Department of Public Safety has already begun the implementation of that, and we've already started the process of hiring that person. And that's the start of actual implementation. And that to me is a sign of good faith. We heard the calls for the need, and we said there's no need for us to wait for a recommendation to come forward. We know what the need was, and we could go ahead and begin making those. Finally, I want to thank a couple groups that really did support us, and everybody's group here supported us in one fashion or another, but in particular the Minneapolis Foundation, Chandra Smith-Baker, both supported us by being a group member and also helping us with fundraising for this. We also got support from the St. Paul Foundation with Ann Mulholland and Eric Jolly. In closing, though, I want to thank the working group people who stayed with us. It's been a long year. We've gone way out of our way and way out of our comfort zone on a lot of these conversations. We had some really, really tough conversations, and I think those were the conversations that we had to have. I want to thank them all for sticking with us, and I want to thank all the families who came every meeting. I tell people this, a lot of folks saw the news coverage of the first hearing and said, oh, this thing didn't work at all. And I said, no. The first hearing was the most powerful community gathering I'd ever been at. Listening to the moms, listening to moms who had lost their children, something that no mom ever thinks they're going to have to do. Listening to them explain that to me made me double down on my commitment to doing the right thing with this. I want to thank the moms, I want to thank the sisters and the moms and the relatives that all came forward to tell us their story. Reliving what was probably, and in my mind, no doubt, the worst day of their lives, cannot have been easy. But it enlightened this process. It has made this process an honest process, and it has brought us to where we are today. So on that note, I want to welcome the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota, Keith Ellison, to give his remarks.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Well, first I want to thank my partner, Commissioner John Harrington, who has been a friend to not only me but to the whole state for a long time. In every role he's played, it's been about protecting community, preserving life, promoting safety. Thank you, sir. I am reminded of a African proverb which goes something like this: if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. The meaning is each one of us comes from a unique perspective. The sheriff, Olmsted County, comes from a unique perspective. His perspective is even different from Chief Matt Goshek, who's a police department. And of course, Brian's perspective as the head of the police union, unique, different from Elijah's perspective from the ACLU, certainly different from everybody else, from prosecutors, mental health community, courts, and of course, Clarence. We all have a unique spot to play, and we could go fast to our position if we just wanted to go alone. But if we actually want to make progress, we got to come together. And we got to go through that process of hammering out ideas, coming up with some things we can all agree on. I guarantee you, nobody got every single thing that they wanted. But we came together around some recommendations that we believe will preserve life, not only of community members, but of police officers too. We regarded this whole community as all of its pieces are essential and important. Yes, we have recommendations that we believe will improve, implicit bias concerns and de-escalation of force. But we also took the issue of officer wellness very seriously and heard from law enforcement perspective, because we know that we value everyone, community, law enforcement, all. And so I want to thank every member of this commission. It wasn't easy. I know that your constituency groups that you recommend might say, well, wait a minute. Don't you remember how they were, what they did? How dare you allow them to talk about us like that? I mean, you sat in that committee, and it's easy for each member of this group to have to face the group that they represent, and folks in those constituencies can criticize them for being a part of this group. But you're a bridge. And the first thing you know about being a bridge is people going to drive on you. That's what happens to bridges, right? But more importantly than being driven over and run over sometimes, you allow places that are separated to be joined. It's easy to sit back and throw a rock and say, oh, that's no good or that's not there. You know what's tough? To actually stick and to stay in a conversation that is going to lead to a benefit in the future. And it's even tougher when there's no guarantee that that's going to happen, but there is at least a chance that it will happen. So I have tremendous respect and admiration for every single person here, and I thank all of them for being part of this. And, let me tell you, Commissioner Harrington was excellent when he talked about all the places that we went and all the people that we talked to. I think that was an essential part of this. Let me add this on, too. We also learned that a substantial number of people, between 30 and 50%, who lose their lives in a deadly force encounter are in a mental health crisis. This is important because I think that we're not aware enough of how factors outside of just, policing and citizen relations really contribute to this overall issue. We can do better and preserve life if we have a stronger grip on how to handle people who find themselves in a mental health crisis. And I think that is an essential thing that we learned. I learned a lot. I'll never forget, and I bet some of you will never forget, that when we were learning about autism, that when officers are trained on what people are going to exhibit when they're going to use force on an officer, that those factors sometimes are very similar to what a person in an autistic meltdown is experiencing. So from the officer standpoint, they may not know which is which. It's important to train on these things, and we talked about it, and I think we're better for it. Let me say that of the 28 recommendations and 33 action steps, they basically fall under 5 pillars. 1, community healing and engagement. That's essential. Prevention and training. Investigation and accountability. Policy and legal implications, and officer wellness. All of these things are important. We want you to take all of them seriously. We want you to know that they are all critically important to us and that we recognize this as the end of the beginning, but the beginning of the middle, which is the implementation phase. We are not going to let these recommendations just sit around on a shelf and not go anywhere. Now, let me just wrap up by saying this. I want to just address a few recommendations. One of them I think is important recommendation: create an independent specialized BCA unit to investigate uses of deadly force. I think this will concentrate experience, concentrate resources. It'll allow folks to really become expert at doing these expertise, which hopefully can expedite the resolution of the investigations, which will exonerate people who should be exonerated, hold people accountable who should be held accountable. I think it is very important, and Mark Rubin of St. Louis County Attorney's Office, representing the Minnesota County Attorneys Association, was critical in that some people raise the issue of what role the Attorney General might play in investigations. Right now, the Attorney General's Office it only has a role to play in criminal investigation in Medicaid fraud. Everything else we do, we're invited in by local authority, and by statute can only come in through the invitation of local authority. We're going to have some conversations on how the Attorney General might be helpful. We're not here to usurp the authority of local authorities. We believe in them, but there might be occasions where we can play a critical role and can be beneficial to the cause of justice, and we're going to have that conversation, and we've talked about that. There are several other critical recommendations that we're going to be exploring, but as I already mentioned and alluded to, adopt a co-responder model to improve outcomes for people with disabilities or who are in a mental health crisis. I think that is very important. You have an officer, sometimes just a young officer, being called to what is truly a scene that is unfolding, and they just don't have the training to deal with somebody in a mental health crisis. I think it's important for us to respond in this way to preserve life and to be more humane to both the officer and the person who may be involved, be the target of law enforcement, because officers very clearly want to do the right thing, and yet they may not even know, and you may have to get a PhD in mental health to know what to do exactly. It's a complicated thing, and it's an important thing that was lended to this effort. And I want to thank Justin Page for being here, offering his views and background on mental health to help get us to the point where we can make this excellent recommendation. So with that, I'm going to resolve my comments and just thank everyone who participated and thank everyone for being here. And I think right now, I'd like to invite to the forefront Mr. Ron Davis, who has been critical in helping us figure out our way forward, and also help thank Jim Koppel. The truth is that no state in the United States has brought together the Attorney General and the Commissioner of Public Safety, who is a top-level appointee of the governor, to talk about how we can deal with deadly force encounters. This is new. This is groundbreaking. And we haven't been perfect, but we've done the best we could. And to the degree that we have been able to be successful is because of Ron and Jim and their firm. So let me introduce you to Ron Davis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Ron Davis. I'm with 21 CP Solutions. And my partner, Jim Koppel, I don't know where Jim is at. He's here today. He's standing in the back. We had the honor of working with the Department of Public Safety and the Attorney General on this project. Before I get into the project, let me tell you my background. 30 years law enforcement in California. And over the last 3.5 years, I spent serving in the Obama administration as the director of what we call the COPS office, the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services. And in 2014, President Obama appointed me to be executive director of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. So why this is important is when I received a call from the state and talking about a working group, it brought back the memories of the task force and how we put something together for President Obama. And I would tell you, as my capacity as the director of the COPS office, this office is responsible for community policing with the over 16,000 local, state, and tribal law enforcement agencies in the United States, and manages something like $1.2 to $1.4 billion in grants to help achieve that. So I've had the capacity over the last 5 or 6 years to work with hundreds, if not thousands, of law enforcement departments, cities, jurisdictions, and states as we try to tackle the issue of community policing. So when I get this call from the state of Minnesota, specifically from Nicole, from the Department of Public Safety, talking about a working group, well, the working group is not necessarily new. Working groups form all the time. But when he said a working group on police deadly encounters, that's new. People can talk about use of force policies or certain parts of it, but when they offered that they wanted to sit down and start talking about police deadly encounters, officer-involved shootings, the investigations, the engagement with families, I could not remember and still cannot think of any state that has done such a thing and do so voluntarily at a time where the only purpose is to reduce death and to increase safety. And so I think that unique expertise, so that unique experience stood out for me, and we thought we should be a part of that. I would say, in this case, I'm going to borrow a phrase from Dante, the process is the product. The Attorney General mentioned part of the process of bringing such a diverse group of stakeholders is that everyone is not going to get what they want. And all we have to take a look is our political discourse today. Just look at what's happening around the country to realize how polarized we are when everyone wants to go it alone. And so to bring such a diverse group together, to be able to have the passionate, sometimes even emotional debate and discussions to come up with consensus around a body of recommendations is trend setting, and you should be very proud. I applaud the Attorney General, I applaud the Commissioner and this working group for willing to do that because they exposed themselves. In the first place they started with, and I think this is the big piece, they started with the truth. And I have a phrase that the truth may hurt, but selective ignorance is fatal. So instead of everybody pretending and being selectively ignorant to what's happening with regards to police deadly encounter, they started with the truth that there's a problem. And sometimes something as small as acknowledging the truth is the way you move forward. For families, for the community, it was Mandela that said it best, only the truth can put the past to rest. So by starting with the truth, now we can work to solutions. You heard the general mention the pillars. And purposely, when you look at the report, you'll see the first pillar is about community engagement and healing, and the last pillar is about officer safety and wellness. Well, we like to look at those as bookends of 21st century public safety in communities. If the community is not a part of it, if the community is not healing, if the community is not engaged, if the community is not leading the effort, nothing's going to happen with regards to public safety or law enforcement. The other bookend, if you don't take care of your cops, if they're not well, if they're not supported, if they're not held accountable, if they're not trained appropriately, nothing's going to happen. So those two bookends is what holds everything together, the community and law enforcement becoming co-producers of public safety, working together, mutual accountability. And that's why when we focused on the issue of police deadly encounters, it's a larger issue. It's with the belief that all shootings and uses of force, in many cases, we have an opportunity to reduce them. Not just those that are illegal, not just those that are improper, even the ones that are fully justified, there's room to take a look at it to see if we can reduce it. It means something to know that 50% of your officer-involved shootings is somebody in crisis. That's an opportunity to reduce that kind of engagement. It does mean something to know the commonality when officers are hurt in the line of duty or some of the post-stress trauma that they're dealing with and whether or not that impacts how they engage the community. So when you look at this report, I ask that you look at it through the lens of how to reduce police-involved deadly encounters, which means there's mutual responsibility on the police, on the community, on prosecutors, on elected officials, on leaders to be able to respond. Also, take a look at it from that this is the first step. There's no one bullet answer. There's not a panacea to this. This is the beginning of a much larger process that that the Attorney General has mentioned, as well as the Department of Public Safety. I also want you to think about this, is that now Minnesota is not going to only make itself safer. This will be a model for many states to follow. I've had the privilege of working right now with the Illinois Attorney General in the consent decree in Chicago, working with the California Attorney General, addressing issues that stem from the shooting of Stephon Clark in Sacramento, and working with agencies all over the country. This is unique. This is groundbreaking, and trust me when I say this, I'm going to take this around to every state that calls me, and even those that don't, because we cannot have a conversation or deal with this if we don't accept the truth, and we don't have the courage to step up and have this discussion. And everyone behind you had the courage to do that. People are going to basically find something wrong with the report. Not everything is in there. There's some things I'm sure every one of these individual members wanted in there that's not in there, but it is the first, most critical step to make sure those bookends come together. So what I'm really looking forward to is to be able to sit back as I go back to California and watch Minnesota now take this baton that the two leaders have handed to you and be able to move forward. And I'm really looking forward to see how this unfolds, because I think this is going to continue to be a national model. So I'll close the way I started. Let me thank you for the leadership of the Attorney General, of the Commissioner, and for the task force members, and for the witnesses that testified, and to see the families. Anyone that has a family or has kids know the idea that you would have to bury your child is just not something that even crosses your mind, that you would even think about. And to see family members come up and to see their pain and to share their pain, and to know that as they're retelling the story, they're re-traumatizing themselves. And to expose that for the one purpose only is to make sure it doesn't happen again. Please do not ignore that voice. Please understand that they drove the people here, and that no one was insensitive to that reality, that everyone was impacted by every family member, every friend, every mother, every father, as well as the professional witnesses that we brought in, not just from Minnesota, but around the country. So that as we lead this effort, it's being driven by evidence-based practices and not just by anecdotes. It's being led by science and research and not just personal opinions, and that some of the recommendations represent the best thinking that this group, that the community, and that the nation has to offer. So I'm really proud of the recommendations. With that, thank you very much. I think I'll turn it back to the Attorney General.
Well, we can open it up to any of the working group members, and then we'll open it up to questions. Go ahead, Eli. Any working group members that would like to speak? And please identify yourself.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Clarence Castile, and I'm the uncle of Philando Castile. First of all, I'd like to say it's been a pleasure to be on the working group, and when I accepted the invitation from the Attorney General and the Commissioner, it was very exciting. I've been here from the beginning, working with all the members on the group, and I've met and made some great friends. They all brought a certain amount of energy to the table, and we came up with a set of really good recommendations. There are some that I'm very excited about. Well, really, I'm excited about them all, but some stick out more to me than others. In action step 4114, it says that the Department of Public Safety will prepare educational material for the public and officers on how to handle a police stop when somebody's illegally carrying a concealed weapon or on their person or in a car. I think that's very important with the way things are going these days and what has happened, especially with what had happened with my nephew. And then there's another action step that I really look at and like. It's that it says that the legislature should research and evaluate the impact of body-worn cameras by 2022. If the evidence suggests they contribute to the public safety and community trust and provide value in daily force encounters, the legislature should encourage and fund and fully implement the use of body cams statewide, understanding that communities have autonomy and choice to adopt body cams. So I think it's important that we look at mandating body cams somewhere in the future. This is a really good recommendation at action step, and I stand by it 100%. The fact is, we have to start somewhere. So we'll start with the researching, but hopefully in the future, we can mandate something like that, because I think it's important that an officer have as many tools on his tool belt, or whatever you call it, to be able to do their job in a really good way, to protect themselves and protect the community, because we're all community, and it's really important. So that's all I have to say. I'm excited to be here. I want to say thank you to the working group and to the commissioner and the AG and everybody who worked on it. Thank you.
Anybody else like to say a few words? Please identify.
That's Ryan.
Yep. Good morning. My name is Elijah Darris. I'm with the ACLU of Minnesota. I coordinate our Smart Justice campaign. For the past year, we have been at the table, have been robust and sometimes heated conversations around how to create better policing, how to create safer interactions between our community and our law enforcement. It was an important table for us to sit at. It wasn't the easiest table to sit at because we come typically from different points of view. However, we all want to see a safer Minnesota. Everyone wants either the law enforcement personnel themselves to go home, or we want the community member to go home. And because of that, we really looked at a lot of policies, practices, and procedures and tried to come up with ways to bridge the gaps bridge any of the divides, recognizing that the hurts and the pains run deep from both sides. And so it was an important table for us organizationally to sit at and to have really robust conversation. We looked at a lot of historical traumas. We had family members come forward. Every last single time a family member opened up their mouths, it hit me deeply. Valerie Castile, for instance, was the first mother to testify. And quite frankly, I'll be honest, after that first day, I literally got in my car and I drove and I drove and I drove. I drove almost to Canada. That's how far I drove, because it deeply, deeply impacted me, hearing the pain, hearing the sorrow, hearing the trauma pour out of the family members. That first day, it was very difficult. Now, we did make the decision to carry on with the hearings and take more testimony in, but this isn't easy stuff. I tell you, the easiest thing would have been to leave the table. The easiest thing would have been to not engage in the conversations and not to take really firm stands when it was necessary. Because I believe in the power of community. I believe that community needs to be centered as we are having these conversations. These conversations cannot and will not be had without community at the epicenter. We are the ones directly impacted. Law enforcement personnel are servants. They are in place in order to serve community. And so if we're not leading in the discussions of how to best serve us, how to best be partners to us, how to listen to us, if we're not at the table when those discussions are being had, when those policies are being created, a major, major gap is going to be there. A lot of confusion is going to set in, and sometimes these gaps and this confusion can turn deadly. Whereas we recognize that it is critical for us to hold our law enforcement accountable, for us to recognize that just like community has trauma and community has pain, there's trauma and pain within the law enforcement community as well. And we seek to also have that trauma resolved, that trauma dealt with. This was critical to us. We don't want police officers within our community that are experiencing unresolved trauma, recognizing that at 9 a.m. an officer might go to a shooting call. At 10:15, that officer might go to a drowned baby. At 3:00 p.m., that officer might go into a fight or something. Who knows? But these are traumatic incidents. Then that person has to wake up and do that again the next day. We have an interest in making sure that we have healthy law enforcement personnel. And if we're not at the table hearing exactly what is being done for the law enforcement community that is policing our community, that are authorized to literally take the lives of community members, if we're not at the table to have those robust conversations and to bring high levels of accountability, whereas we're seeing lacking, who's going to say anything? Who's going to raise up voice? If we're allowing just the law enforcement professionals to operate in the echo chamber in which they're only seeing themselves. And so because of that, despite the fact that it would have been the easiest thing in the world to leave the table and not to engage in sometimes very challenging, difficult conversations. Sometimes some of the conversations that we had were supposed to be for an hour and lasted 3 because we didn't agree. And yet we had to find some way of getting to a middle ground. We had to give up some stuff as community. Law enforcement had to give up some stuff. We had to find a way to get to the middle points. Now we're going to move to the second phase. This is not going to be an intellectual conversations that we engaged in for the past year and then that's it. Phase 2 is implementation phase. This is why we have action steps articulated inside of each one of those. And so organizationally as ACLU, our interest is now looking to see how can we implement some of these actionable tasks that's on there. How can we best partner with law enforcement to make it happen? What resources need to be brought? And that's precisely what we intend to do over the next year.
Right, Eli.
Commissioner and Attorney General, thank you. Jim and Ron, appreciate your work too. And working group members. I'm Kevin Torgerson with the Olmsted County Sheriff's Office in Rochester, Minnesota. I'm here today representing 3 statewide law enforcement organizations that were on the working group: the Minnesota Chiefs Association, Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association, and Minnesota Sheriff's Association. Collectively, these 3 organizations represent nearly 10,000 sworn officers who mostly work in the 87 sheriff's offices and 320 police departments across the state. Representing law enforcement in the working group with myself were the police chiefs from the cities of Minneapolis and Corcoran, police chief and the Mille Lacs tribal community, and the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association. We are pleased the working group recommends expanding resources and increasing awareness for officer mental health and wellness, training in de-escalation techniques, and the recruitment for more diverse officers to law enforcement agencies in our state. These issues are major priorities for the policing profession, and would certainly help law enforcement agencies in every Minnesota community maintain a high level of public safety services. We do not expect the process to stop today. We are hopeful legislation that is drafted or policies developed through the Minnesota Post Board or Department of Public Safety will be developed with continued conversations and subgroups to discuss these recommendations and action steps. We are concerned about some recommendations, particularly as they relate to the due process of officers who have been exonerated and the potential financial burden that agencies to implement some of the training, technology, and initiatives that are being proposed. That said, we have always been and will continue to be willing to work with lawmakers, stakeholders, and community members to find new ways to make our state a safer place for everyone. Thank you.
With that, we'll open it up for questions unless there was somebody else who wanted to. Sorry, Ruben, go ahead.
Last one. Mark Rubin, St. Louis County Attorney. Commissioner Harrington, Attorney General Ellison, can't thank you enough for this opportunity to have served with such an incredible group of people. Ron, you mentioned something about truth. This was all based on truth. Well, I'm fresh off of seeing the movie The Two Popes, and it was Pope Benedict who said, "Truth is vital, but truth without love is unbearable." I have never worked in my 42 years as a prosecutor, never worked with such a caring, compassionate, courageous group of individuals that I've had a chance to work with. All of you, you just really made a difference, and you've restored my confidence, my faith, because it's so easy for somebody to point and say somebody should do something, but who's going to do it? Nobody had to be a part of this group, and nobody had to come and testify. When Eli talked about the tremendous impact of the people who testified, the moms and the other family members, you never forget that. It touches you deeply. But it took a lot of courage for people to come and present evidence to us. People from law enforcement, people whose families were affected. So what I am so pleased with is that this is a tangible beginning. And I think this is a tremendous model. I know as one of the 87 county attorneys in this state that it is our responsibility by law. The law, the statutes of Minnesota say the county attorney has the responsibility to prosecute these cases. And we had a wonderful, very spirited discussion about that issue, as the Attorney General talked about. And to his credit, he is willing and wants to, as he has been since he got elected, to continue that discussion. How can he be a resource, even for the potential conflict case? He's going to be there. And that's one of the recommendations we have, that continue that discussion, and we will make this better. Lastly, I have no doubt in my mind that what we have begun, and it's only beginning, will make it safer for all of the citizens of this state. I have no doubt, and I'm so proud to have been part of this. So, thank you.
Any other comments before we open for questions? All right. Questions for any of the speakers, for anybody here?
Could someone address the statewide de-escalation training? Or is it statewide? It just says required, and I'm curious. You know, is that going to be statewide for every agency? Is there funding for that?
Our recommendation is that we develop the training, that we work with the post board, so that that would be both pre-service training, in-service training, and ongoing and continuing training. We recognize that, as the sheriff mentioned, that there is a financial component of that we have to look at in terms of where the funding would be for that. We recognize that, for example, for the smaller agencies that we talk to, even sending people from their cities to come to training presents a financial burden for them. So we have to look at both the actual cost of the training and the sort of the backside costs of providing it. But yeah, we do hope that this will in fact be training that every peace officer in the state of Minnesota, from those that are just starting their careers to those that are getting ready to conclude their careers, will have, and that they'll have that as an ongoing basis, so that as new dimensions to de-escalation can come up, we can make sure that they are trained to the best standards that are available.
Commissioner Paul Bloom with Fox 9, kind of jumping off the financials there. Another thing that required some money was the idea of creating within your BCA this specialized unit. It specifically says you'll have to get some money from the legislature. Is there a sense of a dollar amount that sort of this package, you want to send a message to the Capitol today? I mean, how much money do we need to start implementing or moving on some of these things?
I don't have a dollar amount for you today, but we are working through what that would look like. Part of the conversation that we had throughout this was both the independence of the investigation, making sure that there were no potential or visible conflicts of interest, but also to make sure that the folks that we were sending out to wherever that happened, and literally since 60% of those are in greater Minnesota, making sure that we have resources that can get to greater Minnesota as quickly as they can to the Twin Cities, that is fully staffed, and that we have the best and the brightest with the best equipment available to that. So we will work through the financial details of looking at what would it cost to actually create that unit, staff that unit, and then continue to maintain that unit.
And may I add that we're glad that Representative Marina Moran and Senator Ingebretson were actually task force members. So it's none of us are legislators, but they are. And so we do have a link to work and put some real meat on those proposals.
Commissioner, there's, tons of recommendations here about statewide stuff. The Sentinel event review, the data collection, the use of force policy review. Nowhere in here does it say who's going to do that. Is this going to be a Department of Public Safety task? I don't see anybody held accountable for getting these things done in this recommendation.
The answer to that is the Department of Public Safety owns many of these recommendations. We recognize that the Post Board also would be involved in the things on state training. The Attorney General's office is a player to many of these. But we recognize that the Department of Public Safety will be at least the catalyst or the convener for many of these conversations. As the state agency that looks at public safety as from a statewide perspective, we recognize that we have a responsibility. That responsibility was clear to me when we started this working group. And nothing that we have seen in the working group thus far has diminished my sense that we have a responsibility to Minnesotans to try and provide them with the best service we possibly can.
So to follow up on Tim's question, will there be another report coming in 2 years, 3 years, 5, telling us how many of these boxes have been checked?
The answer to that is yes. You can expect that from the Department of Public Safety that there will be follow-ups to this, and that we in fact are going to hold ourselves accountable for the recommendations, and we're going to continue to give you reports as we continue to give reports to the legislature about how we've made progress in doing these. And some of these things, I think, there weren't a lot of low-hanging fruit, honestly. The few things that were there that we thought could be implemented without additional state funding or additional state legislation, if they were there already, we would have started them.
And in fact, you did.
We've started some, but we recognize there's a lot more work to be done there. But that is, in fact, a duty that I'm more than willing to take on, and that my agency will continue to not only take on, but report back to you and to the legislature about how we're making progress. You can hold us accountable for that.
Commissioner Bob Crow, I'm a member of the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association. So my question is for Brian Peters, who's the Executive Director of the MPPOA. I reviewed the policies here today that are being made public, so I'm wondering why there's already legislation that's been introduced to already change the officer involved deadly force policy.
Great question, Bob. First and foremost, I want to thank the men and women of law enforcement that put on that uniform each and every day to keep us safe. I didn't want this to be an attack on law enforcement, and it hasn't. However, law enforcement can't, we have to deal with situations that sometimes fester for a very long time. And we have to make quick decisions to de-escalate a situation. And so there are a couple bills that are being proposed that kind of mirror some of the recommendations out of this. And I'm here to say that we do not support any proposed legislation that we're not a part of. The two bills that you're talking about, I believe one has been proposed already, which looks to change our deadly use of force policy, which again, if you read the recommendations, you'll kind of see that they're similar, and we do not support that.
Any other questions for the working group members? We've got time for one more.
Just to be clear, those are not related to this effort?
They are not related to this effort, correct. What I expect out of this is that the conversation continues. To your question about, who's going to take this on, we need to be a part of this. We need to be continuing the conversation because it all can't fall on the Department of Public Safety. And as Sheriff Torgensen said, we're here to talk. We're here to work with groups and make sensible changes to any policies or laws.
And it also all won't fall
Up to the mic, please, thank you.
Yeah, and it also will not just fall within the Department of Public Safety and also the Peace Officers Association and any other law enforcement organization that's represented as well. Community, we're also going to be dead center and very much focused on pushing and driving this agenda forward. Anyone who has worked with me would know that I'm a pretty staunch advocate when it comes to making sure we get things done. I don't never like to partner myself with situations or events that dud out. And so the expectation is that, we are going to drive and push and get a lot of what we have worked really hard to articulate done. And so community is also going to be partnered with this initiative to drive these changes, and they will be happening. Some are going to take years. Some can be done a lot quicker, but they will be happening.
Commissioner, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that I really do believe the Department of Public Safety is that, as you mentioned before, we're a bridge. We're a bridge to bring community, police, and the broader community together to around this conversation. I think that's where this starts. I really do believe that, that line that says that you never doubt that a small group of committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. This is a small group of committed individuals that have come together to try and make life safer for police officers, safer for the community, and safer for all of us. And I really do believe the Department of Public Safety can be the convener. We will continue working with the Attorney General's office. We'll continue working with councils and with the legislature to try and make that happen. And I think that's really what our commitment is. This is the beginning of a new day where we see greater hope, a new day where we see greater safety for all Minnesotans. And that's really what this convening of this working group has been about. And now the real work starts. Thank you.
Thank you.
From Mr. Davis, and then we're wrapped up.
So you asked a question about who's assigned what task. The working group had a lot of discussions about whose name to put up there. And I think part of the challenge is I don't want you to leave thinking that this just idea that are just floating out there with no one being held accountable to do it. So in some of the recommendations, there's specific entities mentioned. In others, they're designed for local law enforcement to be able to do that. But one of the biggest challenges that we're going to see now, and I think the group has addressed that, and it's going to be the key, is how do you take this report and operationalize it so it actually turns into something? Understanding the same thing as I mentioned, those 16,000 local, state, and tribal law enforcement agencies, you got over 300 here. You also have our form of governing. We have the most decentralized policing system in the world. But a part of that is because we have a decentralized governing structure as well. So when you come up with recommendations, there's no one entity that can just put out policy. Not even the federal government can do that. Just say here, from here on, you do all these things. So the challenge is going to be is that there has to be agencies that will step up, the community has to step up, and then everyone has to take responsibility. Individual agencies should take a look at the policies we recommend. And there's a series of recommendations of some of the best practices on what a use of force policy should look like. Post has things to do. But the key that I want you to focus on is what the commissioner said, which is someone has to monitor it, track it, keep pushing it, making sure things happen. Otherwise, it will disappear on the shelf. And I think what this group has talked about and where they're at is going to put them in a position to make sure this does not become some report that disappears. They're already started discussions about, having a report a year from now, coming back to reevaluating to make sure that the legislator knows what funding is needed so that every agency can do it. So a lot of this is going to be to keep pushing that, because it's not going to be as easy as just simply now here's the report, go out and do it. A lot of people are going to want to do it, but may not have the resources. So that fight has to continue. Some people are going to need help getting it, and some are going to reject it. But I hope my recommendation to the group, and I think it was just mentioned about the legislation, I won't get into that, that's for you guys to debate. But whatever moves comes out of this group, that you use the same process you did to develop to put the recommendation together. That it's collaborative, that it's engaging, that everyone has a legitimate voice, that the community's at the table, that law enforcement's at the table, that the rank and file's at the table, that the officers whose lives are on line every day are at the table to even work on what the next legislation is going to look like, what funding's going to look like. Because those voices, I would imagine, the legislator would want to hear in deciding next steps. So this process, let us really kind of end with this process is really the key thing that came out of this, bringing diverse stakeholders together to resolve issues that are some of the most critical issues of our day. Think about, you could cut on news later today, once we get past the jury announcement earlier today, and see that there's always this issue that keeps coming up and keeps coming up. And next time you see it, think about Minnesota, think about your home state and how this looks different than other places.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.